Imagine scaling a mountain barefoot, half-starved, at 13,000 feet while heaving 2-ton blocks of granite uphill. Your muscles burn, your lungs scream for air, and the only promise of rest is a razor-thin straw mat. Welcome to the life of an Inca quarryman at Machu Picchu. In this video, we're peeling back the emerald terraces to reveal the blood, sweat, and tears the empire never recorded. This isn't romance, it sucked. Before any wall of Machu Picchu could rise, before a single terrace could cling to the mountainside, before temples could whisper to the gods, someone had to find the stones. And not just any stones, but the perfect ones. Stones that would last through centuries, through storms, through earthquakes. Stones that would defy time itself. And for the laborers of the Inca Empire, this meant beginning every project, not with a chisel or hammer, but with a quiet march into the heart of the earth. Imagine waking before the sun in the chill of a highland morning. The wind is sharp, your stomach is hollow, and your feet are raw from weeks of hauling. But none of that matters now. You and the others are being led to the quarry, a place not of death, but of transformation. Here, in these massive granite beds split by wind and cold, you will choose the bones of the mountain that will become the walls of heaven. The process begins in silence. Talking is rare, not because of rules, but because of exhaustion. You're surrounded by other workers, some old, some heartbreakingly young. You glance at their faces, weathered, sunburned, worn smooth by the wind. None of you were born to be stoneworkers, but you are here, pulled by the Empire's invisible hand, serving something grand and terrible. You scan the rock face for veins of granite. The stone must be firm, but not brittle. Smooth, yet grippable. Too large, and it will break under its own weight. Too small, and it will be discarded by the overseers. You listen to the older men. They knock on the rock with small stones, judging by sound. Some claim they can feel a good slab just by the vibrations in their arms. You believe them. They've survived this long. Their senses are all they have. Once a slab is chosen, the next horror begins. Separation. The Inca had no iron, no wheels, no pulleys. So every cut had to be done with bronze tools or with nature itself. That meant water, fire, and patience. Workers would wedge sticks into natural cracks in the rock, then soak them in water. As the sticks swelled, the pressure would slowly, painfully slowly, split the stone. Sometimes fires were lit beneath the stone to weaken it, then doused with cold water to crack it from shock. It took hours, sometimes days, and the whole time you were exposed to the elements, the blinding sun during the day, the biting frost at night. And yet, even after all that work, the mountain was cruel. Sometimes, just as a slab was about to come loose, it would snap irregularly, ruining hours of labor. Other times, a perfect cut would fall just inches short, held together by stubborn seams. When that happened, the whole team had to restart, not just with new tools, but with a new stone. No part of the process felt fair. There were no cheers when a stone came loose. No rewards. Just nods, grunts. Maybe a gesture of respect from an older worker. Then it was on to the next one. And there was always a next one. The chosen stones weren't left in the quarry. They had to be dragged, pulled, hauled over terrifying cliffs and narrow trails by the very people who freed them. But before that journey began, each stone had to be blessed. Not by a priest in gold, but by the workers themselves. A whispered chant, a mouthful of coca leaves, a palm pressed flat to the surface in hope that the mountain would not strike back. The Andes weren't just land here. They were alive, angry, watching. Sometimes accidents happened. A stone would shift. A rope would snap, and someone would disappear beneath a weight too heavy for air to carry. When that happened, the others would pause only long enough to bow their heads. The Empire didn't allow mourning. There was work to do, and the stones didn't care. Choosing the stone wasn't a simple task. It wasn't about shape or size. It was about risk. It was about learning which pieces of the mountain could be broken and which ones would break you. There was no machine to lift it, no lever to shift it. It was human will against granite, and the granite almost always won. Some workers became known for their eye. They could spot a stone's flaw before anyone else. But even they weren't immune to the toll. Their hands shook at night. Their legs locked after long days. And deep in their eyes, you could see it, that haunting knowledge that this was their life, not for a season, not for a year, but for as long as they could stand upright. This was how Machu Picchu began, not with ceremony, not with music, but with hands chapped by cold, eyes burned by sun, and backs permanently curved from lifting a future that would never thank them. Once a stone was chosen, the real agony began. It didn't matter how beautiful the slab looked when it came loose from the quarry wall. It had to be reshaped by hand. Every edge, every face, every imperfect surface needed to be turned into something precise, seamless, fitted. Because the Inca builders didn't just stack stones, they locked them with joints so tight that even today, 5 centuries later, not even a razor blade can slip between them. But behind that perfection was pain. The workers tasked with carving the raw granite were not master artisans. They were farmers, conscripts, tribute laborers from provinces hundreds of miles away. Many had never held a chisel before. And yet, with no formal training, they were handed bronze hammers, stone tools, and orders: shape the mountain or be replaced. Granite is one of the hardest stones on earth. Even today, it requires diamond-tipped tools to shape cleanly. But the Inca had no such luxury. What they had was time, muscle, and endless repetition. With nothing but handheld stone hammers and copper chisels, they worked under the sun, hunched over blocks taller than themselves, striking again and again, one chip at a time. The rhythm of the day wasn't measured by the sun's movement, but by the sound of hundreds of hammers echoing off the valley walls. Tunk, tunk, over and over, for hours, for days. Sometimes for weeks, if the block was large, you weren't carving. You were grinding, the edge of your tool dulling before you made a visible dent. The tools themselves were pitiful. Bronze dents easily, stone hammers crack. And when they broke, there were no replacements waiting. You had to make new ones from nearby river stones or whatever was left in the worn-out tool pile. Blisters formed, then burst. Your palms bled. You wrapped them in cloth. The cloth soaked through. You kept going anyway. And if you stopped, you were not allowed to stop. Supervisors, often priests or noble officials, watched from nearby, ensuring each team kept pace. If your stone was behind schedule, you were called forward and your team was punished. Not with beatings, the Inca didn't need to lift a hand. They punished with food, with water, with sleep. Miss your quota, and you might go without coca leaves that helped dull the pain and steady your breath in the thin mountain air. Miss it again, and your meal was halved. There was no rebellion. There was only survival. Precision was not optional. Each surface had to be worked until it matched the engineer. Design, most often drawn in ash on a flat board or carved roughly into dirt. You weren't just shaving the stone. You were solving a puzzle. Each block had to connect perfectly to the ones beside it, every corner angled, every face smoothed. If your stone didn't fit during cast stacking, it was your fault. And there was no way to fix it. You couldn't glue it back. You couldn't patch it. If the surface was too uneven or if the joints didn't line up, the block was sent back, down the trail, back to the quarry, where the entire process would start again. No one wanted that. That meant extra hauling, extra cutting, and extra risk. So you worked slowly, carefully, and in fear. The stone dust clung to everything, your eyes, your nose, your throat. There were no masks, no breaks. The granite filled your lungs as easily as your ears, and soon coughing became a part of daily life, not the kind of coughing you could walk off. The kind that rattled your ribs and made it feel like you were breathing through fabric. Some men tried to moisten the air by chewing coca leaves or spitting on the stone before carving, but it helped little. Over time, many workers began to wheeze, quietly at first, then constantly. Their chests tightened and their strength faded. Those who couldn't keep up were quietly rotated out. No goodbyes, just replaced. And all of this was done under the unforgiving sky. The sun at that altitude didn't warm, it scorched. You could burn through a woven tunic by midday. Then, just hours later, the temperature would plummet. The wind bit into your skin, and the sweat you'd poured into the stone turned cold against your body. There was no shelter, no fire pit, no comfort. You curled up beside your half-shaped block and shivered until morning. Sometimes a worker would whisper a quiet prayer to the Apis, the mountain gods. Others would scratch small marks into the stone they were carving, hoping it would bring luck or maybe leave some trace of themselves behind. It was the only way to claim any part of the work as their own, because no one would remember who cut the stone, only that the wall stood. In the end, the rough cut wasn't the worst part. It was the fact that when the job was done and the stone finally rolled into place in Machu Picchu's glorious walls, no one would know your name, your sweat, your injuries, your pain. You'd be invisible, folded into the myth of a perfect city built by perfect hands, but those hands bled, those lungs gasped, those backs broke, and all for someone else's legacy. Once the stones were cut, they had to move, and that's where things got worse. Machu Picchu wasn't built in the middle of a field. It wasn't even built in a valley. It was carved into the side of a cliff, a jagged mountain ridge nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, with drop-offs so steep they seemed to scrape the clouds, and the stones, some of them weighed over 50 tons. There were no cranes, no wheels, no beasts of burden large enough to carry the weight. If the Inca wanted a stone to move, it had to be done the same way everything else was done, by hand, by body, by brute human will. That's where the shuttle teams came in. A shuttle team was a group of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of workers, tied together by a single goal: get the block from quarry to building site, or don't return. Each team was assigned a specific stretch of the trail, a shuttle leg. Once a stone reached their post, they took over, rolled it, dragged it, heaved it, bent their backs beneath the ropes, dug their heels into the dirt, and strained until the stone shifted forward. Then it moved to the next team, and the next, all the way to the summit. Each movement was a ritual. Before the first pull, the workers would chew coca leaves, not just for energy, but to numb the fear, because this wasn't just tiring, it was terrifying. The trails were narrow, some only wide enough for 2 people across. One misstep, one rolled ankle, one wrong weight shift, and the entire stone could slide sideways and crush anyone in its path. Or worse, it could tumble off the mountain, taking workers with it. No one was allowed to speak of those falls, but everyone knew they happened. The ropes were thick, hand-woven from plant fibers. They dug into your shoulders until your skin blistered, then tore. Some tried wrapping cloth beneath them, but even that didn't help for long. After a few hauls, the cloth shredded. So you bled, quietly. You learned to live with the sting. You learned to pull without screaming. And if you were part of the forward crew, the one steering the stone, your life was even more dangerous. You had to guide the block around sharp bends, over tilted ground, and sometimes across primitive bridges made of vines and stone slabs. One wrong judgment, and the whole thing could tip. When that happened, there were no second chances. The Empire didn't recover crushed workers. It replaced them. The worst was the incline. Some paths rose at nearly 45 degrees, like a staircase meant only for gods. You plant your feet, lean forward, and pull with every ounce of your being, not just once, but hundreds of times, inch by inch. There was no smooth rhythm, no clear measure of progress. You pulled until you heard the order to stop, then you collapsed. Then you stood again. At every shuttle stop, a new team waited. You passed the ropes like a torch. Sometimes the new team would glance at the old one, sunburned, dripping with sweat, eyes vacant. You didn't speak. You just nodded. Both sides knew what the other felt. There was no real rest between pulls. As soon as your team finished its stretch, you were marched back down to repeat it. Up and down, over and over. Like ants dragging a carcass back to the hive. Some did this for weeks at a time, others for months. The lucky ones only broke their bodies. The unlucky ones never made it home. And for all the back-breaking weight, the process was still excruciatingly slow. Some stones took days to move just a few miles. Every obstacle was a new challenge. A slope too steep, a bend too tight, a cliff too sheer. When things got desperate, workers carved new paths right into the mountainside, tearing through vegetation with their bare hands, pushing aside rubble, laying logs to roll the stone just a few more feet. No one questioned it. There was no choice. Once in a while, the stone would get stuck, wedged against the trail, unable to move. When that happened, the team didn't pause. They worked harder. They chanted. They heaved together. Some teams had rhythm leaders who shouted beats to pull by, voices hoarse from endless calls of pull or heave, like drums echoing through the Andes. And above them all, somewhere higher up the mountain, were the priests and supervisors. They didn't pull. They didn't sweat, but they watched. With judgment, with power. If progress was too slow, a priest might offer a blessing ... or a warning. Some say offerings were made to the gods to ensure the stone's movement. No one ever asked what kind of offering. But some workers began each morning with a silent plea, "Let the stone move today. Let us all return tonight." By the time a stone finally reached Machu Picchu, it wasn't just carved. It was baptized in exhaustion. Every inch of its surface was polished with skin, soaked in blood, and burned by sun. And when it clicked into place, the wall rose one level higher. The team was rotated out. And another stone was waiting at the bottom. The Inca called it glory. Tourists today call it genius. But for the men who pulled those stones up cliffs, with open wounds and burning lungs, with nothing but ropes and resolve, it was survival, it was pain, it was silence, and it was the only job they were ever allowed to do. In the shadows beneath Machu Picchu's grandeur, the story they never carved into stone is the one soaked in silence, the story of those who didn't make it. Every stone that rests in those ancient walls hides another truth. Someone was lost beneath it. Accidents were not unusual. They were expected, accepted, even ignored. But to the laborers, the nameless men who carved, hauled, and placed those massive blocks, an accident wasn't just a mistake. It was a sentence. It was the moment when sweat turned to blood, when effort became agony, and when the mountain reminded you who was in charge. It could happen at any time. Maybe it began with a shift in the rope, a slight give, a subtle slip. Someone's hand wasn't placed right, or the stone was heavier than expected. One moment of imbalance, and the entire load began to slide. On the steep, narrow trails that snaked their way up the cliffs, there was no margin for error. One bad step, and you were gone. They say the worst sound was the silence. Not the stone falling, but the breath held by every worker around it, waiting to hear if someone had screamed on the way down. Sometimes no one did. They were gone too fast. The cliff swallowed the sound. The jungle below buried the rest. Others weren't crushed by falling stones. They were crushed beneath them, mid-haul. When a block slipped its rollers or logs sapped beneath its weight, the men holding the ropes had no chance. The stone fell fast, and there was nowhere to run, no space to leap. You either dropped and prayed or you were caught. And once you were caught, you were done. There were no rescue teams, no stretchers, no healers waiting with ARPs and cloth. If your legs were broken, you were carried aside and left to wait, sometimes for help, but more often just to be out of the way. If you were still breathing, others might bring you water. If not, your body was quietly moved. The trail couldn't stop. Not for one man, not for 10. The stone had to keep moving. The gods were watching. The emperor demanded progress. And so workers learned to ignore, to look away. To numb their horror, you could cry, but only when no one was looking. You could whisper a prayer, but only to the wind. No shrines marked the spots where men fell. No stones were laid in their honor. The stones they were building became their only grave markers. There were smaller accidents too, just as cruel in their slow burn. Fingers smashed beneath tools, feet broken beneath stone chips, eyes damaged from flying granite shards. One bad strike from a chisel and your vision could be gone. And yet you worked on, bandaged fingers, swollen joints, limps that never went away. Even the stone itself betrayed you. Granite dust coated your skin, dried your eyes, filled your lungs. Breathing it every day turned strong lungs weak. Coughing became the norm, and over time, that cough didn't go away. It grew deeper, raspier, until you coughed blood or collapsed mid-task. They didn't know the words for lung disease. They just called it being too slow or too tired. You were sent away and someone younger took your place. If you were too injured to work, there was no pension, no rest, no honor. You returned to your village if you could walk. And if you couldn't, you stayed where you were, hoping someone would feed you until you faded. You were remembered only as a worker who couldn't finish the job. The empire didn't mourn its laborers. It recorded no names, no stories, no eulogies. The priest might offer a short chant if the body was found, but most often there was no ceremony. Just dirt, a shallow grave, or nothing at all. Sometimes a fallen worker was simply left beneath the jungle canopy where vines and time would claim him quietly. Still, the others kept going. They had no choice. Their eyes were hollow, their hands calloused, their backs hunched, but they knew what would happen if they stopped. The accidents didn't just wound the body, they shattered the spirit. Each fall, each scream, each silence reminded everyone that this work was not safe. It was not sacred. It was survival. And perhaps the cruelest thing of all, the city that cost them so much would one day be admired for its elegance, its harmony with the mountains, its breathtaking beauty. Tourists would gaze at the walls, marvel at the craftsmanship, and ask, how did they do it? No one would ask, what did it cost? It cost blood. It cost bodies. It cost lives no one remembered. The walls of Machu Picchu didn't rise without loss. Every perfect joint hides the imperfections of broken men. Every stair that lifts a visitor higher stands on the backs of those who fell. And while the stones endured, the workers did not. Before the first stone was ever carved, the mountain had already claimed victory, not through violence, but through the invisible force of the air itself. Machu Picchu wasn't built on flat earth. It was carved out of the heavens. At over 7,900 feet above sea level, the oxygen is thin, the wind is sharp, and every breath feels like a small act of defiance. For the Inca elite, this was sacred, but for the workers, it was suffocation. For those born in the lowlands, farmers, builders, conscripts drafted from faraway provinces, the adjustment to altitude wasn't just uncomfortable. It was devastating. Men who had spent their lives in warm valleys and thick air suddenly found themselves on the edge of cliffs, hauling stone with lungs that could barely fill. You don't feel it at first. Maybe a bit of dizziness, a dry throat. But then the pressure builds behind your eyes, your chest tightens, your heart begins to race. And no matter how deeply you inhale, it's never enough. There was no medical understanding of altitude sickness. There were no warning signs, no rest stations, no instructions. You either adapted or you collapsed, and many did collapse. Some were too proud to stop, others were too afraid. But the body has its limits, and on the mountainside, those limits were crossed every day. The symptoms came in waves: headaches that split your skull in half, nausea that made every meal feel like poison. Your legs turned heavy, your vision blurred. Some fainted mid-haul. Others pushed through, only to find themselves shaking uncontrollably, coughing up mucus, or bleeding from the nose. The cold only made it worse. The nights bit deep into your joints, and the morning frost punished you before your first step. Coca leaves became a lifeline, not a luxury. Chewing them helped dull the altitude's edge, easing breath and focus. But coca was rationed, controlled, sacred. Not everyone got enough. Some begged for more. Others snuck leaves in secret. Those caught hoarding were punished, not just by their overseers, but by their own team. Coca wasn't just for energy, it was hope. Without it, the mountain owned you. And then the work began. Carrying massive stones up narrow trails wasn't just a test of strength, it was a test of breath. Every step demanded more oxygen than the air could give. Every muscle pull drained the little energy your body had left. You didn't breathe in rhythm. You gasped. You wheezed. Some men began coughing violently, desperate for air that wasn't there. Others held their breath during the hardest parts, only to collapse seconds later in a dizzy spiral of blackness and stars. There was no such thing as taking it slow. You moved at the team's pace. If you couldn't keep up, the rope dug harder into your hands. If you fell behind, the others had to compensate. And that built resentment, not sympathy. No one could afford weakness. Weakness made the work longer, harder, more dangerous. And danger on these trails meant someone might not return. Sometimes, in the dead quiet of night, a worker would stare up at the stars and wonder how the Empire had the audacity to build a city up here. Who thought this was the right place? Who looked at a knife-edge mountain ridge and said, "Yes, we'll drag heaven up here." It was beautiful, yes, from a distance. But up close, it was brutal. And it was the laborers who paid for that beauty, one frozen breath at a time. Even resting didn't help. The thin air robbed you of recovery. Sleep was shallow, interrupted by the cold, the wind, and the altitude. You'd wake up with a racing heart, drenched in sweat, unsure if you were sick or simply adjusting. Some never adjusted. They simply faded, thinner every day, quieter until they couldn't lift anymore. Then they were sent away or left behind. The high altitude also played tricks on the mind. Hallucinations weren't rare. Men sometimes claimed to see spirits walking beside them on the trail. Others heard voices in the wind. Whether it was the gods, the ghosts of the fallen, or just the lack of oxygen, no one could say, but the fear was real. And in the thin air, fear had a way of creeping deeper. Priests told them that the air was sacred, that the closeness to the sun, the gods, the stars made this place divine. But for the men pulling stone, it wasn't heaven. It was a slow suffocation, a daily fight against a mountain that never offered mercy. The altitude was invisible, yes, but it was always present in the way men gasped between words, in the way hands trembled during carving, in the coughing fits that echoed through the night, in the sunken eyes of those who had lost too much breath to continue. And worst of all, no one would remember it. The stones told no stories of breathless bodies. The walls spoke nothing of the lungs that failed, the lives shortened. Tourists would marvel at the ingenuity. Historians would debate the architecture. But no one would ask, how did they even breathe? Because the answer was, they barely did. The mountain didn't just starve your breath, it starved your body. Laboring day and night on the cliffs of Machu Picchu wasn't just a battle against stone or altitude. It was a battle against hunger. Not the kind of hunger you complain about between meals. This was the slow, hollow ache of a stomach that never quite filled, a quiet suffering that gnawed at your core, day after day, until exhaustion became your baseline. To fuel the impossible work of hauling tons of granite up thousands of feet, the workers needed food, real food. But what they got was something far more meager. The diet of a Machu Picchu laborer was minimal, controlled, and always just barely enough. It was never designed for comfort. It was designed to keep you moving, and only just. Most days began with a handful of chocolate, large kernel Andean maize, dried and boiled. Sometimes there was quinoa too, if the stores were full, and maybe on better days, a small boiled potato. It was warm, starchy, and bland. That was it. No oil, no salt. No fat to replenish what the cold and labor stripped from your body. It filled your mouth, but not your muscles. For protein, that was rare. Guinea pig, kai, was reserved for ceremonies or high-status supervisors. Workers might see it, smell it roasting over fires they weren't allowed near, but rarely tasted it themselves. Llama meat was even rarer, and not wasted on common hands. Occasionally, a bit of dried fish might make its way into a meal if it had traveled well from lower villages, but it was more bone than flesh by the time it reached the mountaintop. The bulk of the calories came from mote, soaked maize, and oca, a root vegetable like sweet potato, eaten raw or barely cooked. It was chewy, it was tough, and it did little to help your energy last through a full day of hauling stone or carving blocks in the sun. There was no concept of snacks. Breaks were limited. Meals were scheduled. You ate when your overseer allowed it, and never until you were full. If your team was falling behind, or if offerings were needed for the gods, food might be withheld entirely. Not as punishment, but as motivation. Hunger, they believed, pushed the body harder, and when it didn't, you simply worked through it. Water was another challenge. While the Incas had ingenious canal systems and small stone fountains at the top of Machu Picchu, those were often reserved for the nobles and priests. Workers drank from whatever mountain streams or rainpot pots they could find. It was clean, usually cold, always, but never quite enough. Dehydration didn't come with fanfare. It crept in. You'd feel dizzy, your lips cracked, your tongue thick and dry as you dragged another block uphill. Coca leaves, again, were crucial. Not food, exactly, but survival. They dulled hunger. They tricked the body into pushing longer, harder. A few leaves chewed slowly throughout the day could delay fatigue, delay the shaking, the loss of focus. But coca was rationed, and those who chewed too much, too fast, paid the price in nausea, racing heartbeats, or complete collapse. Some workers developed rituals around eating. Small prayers to the apis, the mountain spirits, before each bite. A shared potato split into 4 parts and passed hand to hand. Not for religion, for comfort, for solidarity, for the reminder that for a few moments they weren't alone, but the weight of hunger left marks. Bodies thinned, faces sharpened, eyes darkened with fatigue. Backs bent more quickly. Young workers began to look old. The mountain didn't just take strength, it took years. And if you were injured, if your energy failed and you couldn't keep up, your rations could be cut. Not enough food to justify your presence. That was the quiet logic of the worksite. Some begged to stay on lighter tasks. Others tried to sneak portions. But sharing was dangerous, punishable. Every meal was tracked. Every bite accounted for. A worker caught taking more than allowed could lose his spot on the team, or worse, be sent back down the mountain, dismissed in disgrace. There were no feasts, no moments of abundance, only the grinding monotony of subsistence. You didn't eat to live. You ate to keep walking, to keep pulling, to keep your name off the replacement list. And still, the empire called it greatness. Machu Picchu's walls were praised for their perfection, their endurance, their harmony with nature, but nature did not feed the builders. Nature fought them with wind, cold, and famine, and the state did little to help. The Inca were masters of logistics, yes. They moved food across valleys and kept detailed stores in their tambos, or way stations. But those stores were prioritized for soldiers, messengers, priests. Workers ate what was left, and only if they'd earned it. Years later, when archaeologists uncovered the remains of laborers buried near the site, they found signs of chronic malnutrition, shortened limbs, stunted growth, worn teeth, brittle bones. Their diets left a physical record. They built Machu Picchu on empty stomachs, and their bodies paid the price. So when you look up at those polished stones, remember this. Behind every seamless joint was a man who hadn't eaten enough in days, pulling more than he should, gasping for air, praying for strength, and chewing stale corn in silence. Not because he believed in the empire, but because there was no other choice. When the sun dipped behind the jagged ridges of the Andes, the world didn't just grow dark, it turned hostile. The daytime heat that baked every stone and scorched bare skin vanished in minutes, replaced by a cold so sharp it felt alive. Working at Machu Picchu meant surviving the mountain by day and enduring its revenge by night. And for the laborers, the night was worse than the stone. Most people don't realize how cold the highlands of Peru can get. Machu Picchu sits nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, perched between cloud and sky. Temperatures plunged after sunset, often dropping near freezing or below. The stone walls radiated out what little heat they'd absorbed, and a bitter wind crawled down the cliffs like an invisible predator. It sliced through the thin woven tunics the workers wore, sank into their bones, and stayed there until morning. There were no warm fires waiting, no wool blankets, no shelter thick enough to stop the chill. Workers huddled in makeshift camps beside the unfinished city, small alcoves dug into terraces or lean-tos built from branches and discarded stones. These weren't homes, they were barely even tents. Just fragments of cover, barely strong enough to stop the wind from slapping you awake every few minutes, and still they tried to sleep. The ground was hard, cold, sometimes damp from rain or mist. Men curled into themselves, wrapping their arms around their ribs, knees drawn to their chests, trying to trap what little body heat they still had. Some lay beside each other, shoulder to shoulder, not out of friendship, but out of necessity. The body was the only source of warmth left when the sun disappeared. Sleep wasn't peaceful. It was a negotiation with misery. You drifted in and out, heart pounding, limbs trembling, dreaming of fire or of nothing at all. Sometimes you woke with your teeth chattering so hard your jaw ached. Other times you woke because you'd stopped shivering entirely and your body had gone numb. That was the real danger. When the cold stopped hurting, it meant something inside you was shutting down. If you were lucky, you had coca leaves to chew before bed. They helped your blood flow, dulled the edge of the cold, helped you forget your hunger just enough to doze. But they didn't last, and you were always rationed. If you used too much before nightfall, you paid for it in the darkness. Many workers came from warmer valleys. They weren't used to this kind of cold. Their skin cracked, their joints stiffened. Some developed frostbite on their fingers and toes, unnoticed until their limbs turned a pale, lifeless gray. There was no treatment, no salves. You were expected to keep working, even if you could barely hold a chisel. If you couldn't, you were rotated out, not to rest, but to disappear. The cold also robbed you of strength. A body shivering all night cannot lift a stone the next day. Muscles refused to respond. Fingers lost their grip. The morning's first task wasn't just carving or hauling. It was simply forcing yourself to move again. And when the sun finally rose, it brought no warmth at first, just light. A reminder that you had survived another night, barely. Illness spread easily. There was no fire to dry soaked clothes or warm shivering bones. A cough turned into fever. Fever turned into silence. If someone died during the night, curled beside a stone wall, the others said nothing. A quiet prayer, a bowed head. Then they moved away and gave thanks that it hadn't been them. Yet still, no one fled. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. These weren't volunteers. They were drafted from conquered regions, relocated by the empire, chosen as tribute labor. To flee was to betray your family, your village, your life. And so they endured the cold as they endured the stone. One shiver, one breath, one miserable night at a time. There were moments, rare and private, when the stars made it worse. The Andean sky is crystal clear at night, filled with impossible constellations. To the nobles and priests, those stars were sacred maps, stories etched in heaven, but to the workers, they were just a reminder of how far they were from warmth, from home, from comfort. They looked up and saw no gods, only distance, and no one told their story. Today, tourists arrive at Machu Picchu as the sun rises, marveling at the mist curling around the stone walls, admiring the genius of its design. But they do not feel the cold that came before the sunrise. They do not lie awake in the dirt, praying for the wind to stop, for dawn to come, for one more hour of survival. The cold was a second enemy, one that could not be lifted, cut, or moved. A silent weight that settled over every chest, every limb, every soul. It didn't take your life in an instant. It wore you down, night after night, until your body stopped fighting back. And when you were gone, there were no words carved in stone. Only silence, only stars, only cold. The stones were heavy, the air was thin. The cold was punishing, but even worse than the physical burden was the one the workers couldn't see, the constant, unrelenting pressure to satisfy the gods. Because at Machu Picchu, you weren't just building for the empire, you were building for the heavens. And heaven, it seemed, was never satisfied. To the Inca, the gods were everywhere, in the mountains, in the rivers, in the sun and the sky. The very rock you carved was sacred. The cliffs you dragged it up were alive. And Machu Picchu wasn't just a real estate or a fortress. It was a spiritual bridge, a place where the divine met the earth. That meant every inch had to be perfect. Not for beauty, but for worship. Every imperfection, every delay, every accident was seen as a sign. The gods were displeased. For the workers, this meant living in fear of more than just failure. It meant living in fear of divine punishment. You could be doing everything right, carving well, hauling fast, showing up early and staying late. But if a stone cracked unexpectedly, if a trail washed out, if a priest had a bad dream or a strange reading from the stars, it didn't matter. Someone would be blamed. Someone would suffer. And usually, it wasn't the nobles or the architects. It was the ones closest to the dirt, the workers. Priests moved among the labor teams often, not just as observers, but as spiritual enforcers. They watched the work, made offerings, chanted prayers. Sometimes they blessed the tools. Other times, they blamed the workers. If things went wrong, the priest might declare a cleansing necessary. Sometimes that meant fasting. Other times, rituals, long ceremonies where you knelt for hours in the cold, breathing incense and begging for forgiveness. But the worst was when the gods were angry. You could feel it in the silence. The priests whispered. The overseers stiffened, and the rumors would spread. The gods demand more. The mountain is not satisfied. The workers knew what that meant. Offerings. Small at first, coca leaves, woven cloth, food. These were easy. But when things truly went wrong, when stones broke or storms rolled in, bigger sacrifices were made. Llamas, guinea pigs, sometimes even people. Human sacrifice was rare, but real. And while it was usually performed with ceremony, with preparation, that didn't make it any less terrifying. Some of the most sacred offerings were children, selected from noble families and prepared for years. The laborers weren't fools. They knew that if disaster struck, if a wall collapsed or a storm ruined weeks of work, the gods might ask for a different kind of payment, a quicker one, a nameless one. Was it superstition? Maybe, but the fear was real. It weighed on every shoulder, not just the fear of death, but the fear that your suffering wasn't enough, that all the pain, hunger, and exhaustion still hadn't pleased the sky, that your gods were watching and disappointed, and so workers began to internalize the ritual. Some made small shrines out of stone chips in quiet corners. Others whispered prayers into their palms before lifting a block. Some carved tiny symbols into the backs of stones before they were laid, markings only the mountain would see. Not rebellion, not defiance, just desperate attempts to be seen, to be spared, to matter, because no one told their stories. The priests spoke of divine will. The records told of royal glory. The stones carried names, but never yours. You were invisible, even as you lifted the empire skyward. And when something good happened, a wall went up, a stone clicked perfectly into place, the praise went to the gods. Never the hands that bled to make it so. It's easy to romanticize Inca religion today, the harmony with nature, the reverence for sun and earth, the brilliant temples and sacred alignments. But for the worker, it wasn't harmony. It was pressure, unceasing, inescapable. You didn't just work for the emperor. You worked for unseen powers who never spoke, never praised, and never forgave. That's what made Machu Picchu so suffocating. It wasn't just a job. It was a judgment. Every block you laid was a test. Every crack was a failure. Every bad omen might cost someone their life. And no matter how hard you worked, no matter how much you gave, the mountain always wanted more. No one volunteered to build Machu Picchu. You didn't raise your hand. You didn't sign up. You were taken, swept into the machine of empire like a leaf in a storm. It happened suddenly, often without warning. A messenger would arrive in your village bearing orders sealed by the state. The empire needed labor, and your family had a debt to pay. They called it mitit, a labor tax, a duty to the emperor. In theory, it was temporary, a few months, maybe a year. You worked, and then you returned to your village. But no one ever really believed it would be that simple. Once you left, there were no promises. The selection process wasn't a ceremony. It was a tally, a name read aloud, a finger pointed. You, your brother, your cousin, sometimes your father, sometimes your son. If your family had sent someone the previous year, it didn't matter. The quota had to be filled. The stone wouldn't lift itself. Your mother didn't cry until after you left. Your siblings stood silent. You packed quickly because there wasn't much to take. A woven tunic, a small pouch of dried corn, maybe a carving knife passed down from someone who had done the same journey years before. And always that unspoken fear. Would you ever come back? The road to Machu Picchu was long. You walked for days, sometimes weeks, alongside others who had also been taken, strangers bound together by silence and dread. The higher you climbed, the thinner the air, the more your stomach tightened. Some vomited from altitude, others from fear. You could see the mountains rise around you like walls. You could feel the weight of what was coming, even if you didn't know the details. And when you arrived, it wasn't what you expected. There was no city, not yet. Just slabs of stone, half-laid terraces, raw walls waiting for completion. Priests stood at the highest points, chanting toward the sun. Overseers barked orders in Quechua. Labor teams swarmed like ants along the cliffs, and you were assigned a rope, a chisel, a spot on the line, no training, no explanation, just the simple truth. This was your life now. Some were lucky, given tasks like cooking or hauling water. Others were sent to the quarries or placed in hauling teams. And if you were strong, that didn't help. It meant you were picked for the hardest work. You'd carry the ropes. You'd lift the blocks. You'd risk being crushed. You worked from sunup to sundown with brief breaks for food and ritual. The priestess said the emperor watched from afar, that the gods above judged every movement. But no one judged fairly. If you worked fast, you were pushed faster. If you worked slow, you were punished. If you broke, you were replaced. And every night you lay on the stone floor of a makeshift shelter, thinking of home, your family, your fields, the sound of birds in the valley, the smell of your mother's cooking, the laughter of someone you'd hoped to marry. It felt like a different life, a dream you could barely remember. There was no pay. That wasn't how Mida worked. The reward was service to the empire. A strange idea. When all you felt was pain, they told you your work would be remembered, but no one ever learned your name. You'd return if you returned, broken and thinner. No medals, no land, just silence. And worse still, you were expendable. If you were injured, you were replaced. If you died, another name was called. The system kept moving because the stones had to rise. The terraces had to be finished. The gods had to be pleased. Some tried to run. They didn't get far. The empire had runners faster than anyone in the villages, and roads watched by guards. If you were caught, you were beaten. If you resisted, you disappeared. No one ever escaped the Mida system, not really. It followed you year after year like a shadow. And yet, through all of it, some part of you still hoped. You told yourself the wall you carved would be remembered, that someone would look at that smooth edge and know the pain behind it, that the gods would forgive your fear, that your family would welcome you back. But most knew the truth. The empire didn't build with hope, it built with blood. Machu Picchu was not created by choice, it was carved from duty, from fear, from stolen years. And while history remembers the emperors, the architects, and the priests, it forgets the ones who never asked to be there. The draftees, the conscripts, the unwilling hands behind every sacred stone. Once you were up the mountain, there was no coming down, not really. Machu Picchu wasn't just high in the sky. It was isolated, a kingdom of clouds surrounded by cliffs and cut off from the world below. What made it beautiful to modern eyes made it a prison for those who built it. The trails that wound up the cliffs were steep, narrow, and treacherous, often no wider than a man's foot. On one side, loose stones and sharp bends. On the other, a sheer drop into jumbled nothingness. One misstep, one loose sandal, one moment of dizziness from hunger or altitude, and you were gone. No recovery, no rope to catch you. Just the silence of the forest below. And even if you didn't fall, the descent was forbidden. You were there to work. You were brought there to stay. Machu Picchu was not a job site, it was a sentence. You couldn't wander. You couldn't visit your village. You couldn't turn back. Once your name was added to the labor roster, your world became stone, sky, and suffering. Some men begged to return home, especially in the early days when the city was little more than a skeleton of terraces and sacred intentions. They thought maybe if they worked hard enough, fast enough, they'd be released early. But the empire had no room for sympathy. The job ended only when the mountain said so. The priest declared the work blessed. The architect nodded. The overseer grunted, and maybe you'd be allowed to leave. But no one left the same, and many didn't leave at all. Injured workers were escorted back down to safety. They were left in small lean-tos near the edge of the site, fed scraps, given water, and slowly forgotten. Sometimes they recovered. Often they didn't. When a man grew too weak to move, he simply remained where he lay, a shadow near the stone. A ghost in the fog, the younger workers noticed. The older ones said nothing. There were stories whispered at night. Stories of men who tried to descend without permission, who took the winding path in the dark, hoping to reach the forest and disappear. Some were caught and dragged back. Others were never seen again. Perhaps they made it home. Perhaps not. No one asked. The air was too thin for hope. And there were other dangers. Not just the cliffs or the guards or the sickness, but the knowledge that even if you made it back, the Empire could find you again. The Midi system didn't forget. If you evaded labor once, it only meant someone else in your family had to pay the price. Your brother, your son, your father, so you stayed. Not just because of fear, but because of guilt. At Machu Picchu, time stretched strangely. Each day mirrored the one before. Wake, work, endure, sleep, dream of escape, and begin again. The mountain didn't just trap your body, it pressed on your soul. You could see the valleys below, mist curling in the morning white, green and full of life. But you couldn't reach them. They became symbols of a life you used to have and might never see again. It wasn't a cage made of bars, it was a cage made of duty. The priest said the mountain was sacred, that to live and labor here was a gift, that the spirits watched every stone, every drop of sweat, every breath. But the spirits never carried your pain. They didn't bleed from lifting. They didn't freeze when the sun disappeared. You did. And so you learned to numb yourself. You stopped counting the days. You stopped looking down the trail. You stopped hoping. Instead, you focused on the stone in front of you. You lifted. You carved. You endured. Because there was no other choice. Even now, centuries later, the only way to reach Machu Picchu is to climb. Tourists come by train and bus, but the final leg is still uphill. Steps cut into the earth, winding through green cliffs like scars left behind by ancient hands. Most never think about the workers who walked those same steps, day after day, with ropes digging into their shoulders and stomachs empty. They marvel at the view, take photos of the stone, feel breathless at the altitude. But the original builders were breathless for other reasons. Not awe, not beauty, but exhaustion, fear, isolation. No one built Machu Picchu because they wanted to. They built it because they were told to. And once they were there was no way down. If the mountain broke your body, the overseers broke your spirit. They weren't gods. They weren't nobles. They were something worse, men given just enough power to forget they were once like you. The Inca called them foremen or supervisors, but to the workers on Machu Picchu, they were eyes in every shadow and footsteps behind every mistake. They didn't carry stone. They didn't chisel rock. They carried authority, and with it came the freedom to command, to threaten, to punish, and most of all, to watch. You were never alone. Every step you took, every breath you wasted, someone was judging if it was fast enough, straight enough, loyal enough. The overseers came from higher castes or had proven themselves loyal to the state. Many were former soldiers, men hardened by war, taught that mercy was weakness and delay was treason. They saw the laborers not as human beings, but as tools, replaceable, interchangeable. If one broke, another would come. If one slowed, he made the team weaker. If one resisted, he made an example of himself. Instructions were shouted, not spoken. Whips were real, not symbolic. You felt the difference between obedience and defiance, not in words, but in your skin. There were rules, yes, but they always favored the overseers. If you dropped a stone, it was negligence. If you carved the wrong line, it was sabotage. If you worked too slowly, you were punished in front of your peers. Not always violently, sometimes with withheld food, coca, or rest. But sometimes dog got worse, a blow to the ribs, a push toward the cliff edge, an accidental slip on the rain-slick steps. Fear became routine. You didn't just fear the mountain. You feared the man standing behind you. the one who wore better shoes, the one who didn't carry tools but carried your fate. And yet, the cruelty wasn't constant. That made it worse. Sometimes an overseer would share a joke, offer an extra bite of maize, praise a well-cut stone. You began to hope maybe he wasn't like the others. Maybe you had earned a bit of grace. But that moment always vanished, because the next mistake you made, he remembered none of your effort, only your failure. This unpredictability made the air tighter. You never relaxed. You never trusted. You worked with your head down, not out of focus, but because eye contact was a risk. If they saw rebellion in your eyes, even imagined it, you pay. Some workers tried to form quiet bonds of solidarity, sharing coca secretly, covering for each other, finishing a comrade's load in silence. But the overseers knew how to sniff out loyalty. They seeded suspicion, spread rumors, rewarded snitches. Soon, even your fellow workers looked at you sideways. The threat wasn't just above you anymore, it was beside you. Occasionally, the emperor's higher officials came to inspect the site. Dressed in bright robes, they walked among the laborers with their heads high, speaking in riddles about divine glory and imperial vision. The overseers became perfectly polite in those moments, standing tall, reporting numbers, praising their crews. But once the officials left, their boots returned to backs. Their voices returned to iron. It was theater, a cruel performance. And the workers were its blood and bone. Not all overseers were monsters. Some were just afraid of failing their own masters, afraid of punishment if their teams lagged, afraid of losing the little power they'd been given. But fear doesn't excuse brutality, it explains it. And to the man lifting stone with cracked fingers and a swollen back, fear was no excuse at all. The worst moments were the quiet ones, when the overseer stood behind you and said nothing. You felt his breath, his silence, his waiting. The pressure to perform perfectly under invisible judgment. You wanted to scream, but you didn't. You couldn't. You just carved deeper, faster, until your hands shook. And even then, it might not be enough. Sometimes men were beaten simply to remind others what could happen. Not for any mistake, but as a warning. A man might be dragged in front of his team, his tunic torn, his dignity stripped, just to plant a seed of fear. That was the logic. If fear kept the stones moving, then cruelty was a tool of progress. Today, historians admire Machu Picchu's precision. The seamless stones, the masterful planning, the architectural brilliance, but precision comes at a price. Perfection is never born from freedom. It is carved out of fear. The overseers made sure of it. They weren't gods, but they were the ones who decided who went home and who didn't. When the work was finally done, when the stones were set, the terraces shaped, the temples aligned with sun and star, there was no celebration for the ones who built it, no farewell feast, no ceremony beneath the sacred Intihuatana stone. Just silence, just aching limbs and a trail that led away from everything you'd suffered. The overseers stopped shouting. The tools were collected. The laborers, once driven like cattle, were now dismissed like dust brushed from a robe. Your task was finished. Your purpose used up. You were no longer needed, but you didn't leave proud. You left broken. For years, your world had been stone and pain. You had been told it was holy work, that the gods watched and the emperor gave thanks. You had believed, or tried to believe, that your suffering meant something, that each slab you carved, each block you hauled, was part of something eternal. But as you descended the mountain, limping or carried, skin weathered and muscles torn, no one stopped to honor you. No names were read. No gratitude was spoken. You were simply ... gone. Some were allowed to return to their villages. Others were sent to new work sites, another mountain, another city, another draft. The Mida never ended. The empire always needed more. And even if your term was over, your body wasn't the same. Your strength was thinned, your spirit dimmed. You were not who you once were, and worse, your people knew it. In the village, others had taken your place. Your home had changed. Your children had grown. Your crops were someone else's now. You didn't return a hero. You returned a stranger, a reminder of what the empire could take. And what had it given you? No wealth, no land, no comfort. Only memories, most of them silent. You couldn't speak of the worst nights, the frozen dawns, the fear in your chest when you heard an overseer's footsteps behind you. Who would listen? Who would believe? The priests had written nothing of your efforts. The architects took credit for the design. The rulers smiled from gold-lined halls, their names carved deep in stone. But your name? It was never recorded, never remembered. Your bones ached from the cold. Your fingers curled unnaturally from years of gripping ropes and chisels. You awoke in the night still thinking you heard the crack of stone or the whistle of wind at the summit. Machu Picchu did not stay behind. It followed you, etched into your body like a second skin. And the worst part, you were proud. Not because you wanted to be, but because you had to be. Because believing it meant something was the only way to survive it. Some workers were never seen again. Lost to injury, disease, collapse. They became part of the mountain, literally. Buried in unmarked graves on the outskirts of the city. Their remains discovered centuries later, worn thin, often deformed by malnutrition and overwork. Their bones told the truth history refused to write. Even today, Machu Picchu is called a marvel, a lost city, a wonder of the world. Tourists wander its polished paths, marveling at the precision, the beauty, the mystery. But they rarely ask who built it. They take photos of the walls, not the people who suffered to raise them. They admire the silence, not realizing it was built on voices that were never allowed to speak. The work ended, yes. But for the workers, the suffering lingered. Long after the last stone was set, the empire still lived in their joints, in their dreams, in the way their hands shook when they reached for a tool again. And when they died, often young, often unnamed, no monument rose in their honor, because in the eyes of the empire, they were never meant to be remembered. But that's the truth behind the wonder. Machu Picchu wasn't just built by hands. It was built by lives, stolen, spent, forgotten, and for those who gave everything, finished never meant free. It meant only this: you are no longer useful. And that is why it truly sucked to be a worker at Machu Picchu. Before the marvel, before the temples kissed the sky, there was only stone. Cold, unforgiving, monstrous slabs of stone that had to be moved, not with wheels or beasts or machines, but with bare hands and bodies worn thin. If you were a worker at Machu Picchu, your life was measured not in hours, but in the weight you could carry. And the weight never stopped. The stone wasn't local. Not all of it. Much of it came from distant quarries, far below or hidden deep in the Andean slopes. Getting it to the site was a journey of days, sometimes weeks, dragging, rolling, lifting, and praying it wouldn't crack along the way. Because if it did, your punishment was not just starting over. It was knowing your suffering had been for nothing. There were no wheels in the Inca Empire. No pack animals large enough to help. Llamas were revered, but too small. Oxen didn't exist. The terrain was too rough anyway. Steep, wet, jagged. So the empire turned to the only resource it had in abundance: people, you, your back, your legs, your sweat. You and dozens of others were strapped to ropes woven from thick plant fibers, wrapped around stones the size of small rooms. Each tug forward was a battle. You dug your feet into the earth, gritted your teeth, and leaned with everything you had. 1, 2, 3, pull. The overseers shouted, the priests prayed. The mountain stayed still, and the stone moved only when you bled for it. Even when the stones reached the site, your suffering wasn't over. Now came the vertical part, pulling these multi-ton blocks up sharp inclines through switchbacks so narrow the wind could shove you off. Wooden sleds groaned under the weight, ropes dug into your shoulders like knives. When one man slipped, the whole team nearly went with him. You learned to cry without making a sound. There wasn't time for pain, only progress. Every step was an argument with gravity. The high altitude made your chest ache. Your breath came shallow. Your heart raced not from panic, but from a constant lack of oxygen. Still, the stones had to go up. No one cared how, just that they did. And the worst part, the stone wasn't dead. Not to the Inca. To the priests, each block had a spirit. A will. A mood. If a stone refused to move, cracked, slid, broke a rope, it wasn't just a problem. It was an insult to the gods. The laborers were told to apologize to the rock, to beg its forgiveness, even as their backs gave out and their skin split open. Imagine that, being made to bow to the thing crushing you. Some workers didn't make it. A single misstep could lead to catastrophe, crushed under stone. Dragged over a ledge, bones shattered against ancient earth. No one halted work for the fallen. A quick ritual, a mumbled chant, and then another rope was tied to another back. Your death wasn't a tragedy. It was a delay. Your hands were raw, even through the tough fabric of your gloves. Your fingers blistered, your spine bent over time. Some men walked upright when they arrived at Machu Picchu and could no longer stand straight a month later. Their backs permanently hunched, their joints ruined, but still they carried. At night, your muscles twitched in your sleep, still remembering the weight. You dreamed of stone, not as something you lifted, but something pressing down on your chest, slowly crushing your breath. You woke in the dark, gasping, and still morning came too soon. And for all that, there was no recognition. No relief. When a stone finally reached its place, when it clicked perfectly into the wall with no mortar, no cement, held there by nothing but precision and pressure, the credit went to the gods, or to the nobles, or to the architects, but not to the men who dragged it, cursed it, begged it to move. Even centuries later, people marvel at the craftsmanship. They say the stones are so perfectly cut you can't fit a blade of grass between them, that they've survived centuries of rain and earthquake without collapsing, that the Inca were geniuses. But the stones were more than architectural wonders. They were tombs for strength, prisons for the energy and hope of 1,000 broken bodies. You don't see that when you visit Machu Picchu. You see the view, the mist, the glory. You don't see the hands that bled beneath it, because those hands were buried long ago, not in the earth, but in silence. The stones still stand, and beneath them, ghosts still pull. Every breath was a battle. Machu Picchu may not be the highest peak in the Andes, but at nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, it was high enough to turn breathing into labor. For the workers, this wasn't just tiring, it was life-threatening. Every task, every lift, every climb took place in a world where the air itself fought back. And no matter how strong you were at sea level, up here, even your lungs felt like they were quitting. The air was dry and thin. Oxygen was scarce. The moment you arrived, you felt it, a tightness in your chest, like someone had looped a rope around your ribs and started pulling. Your head spun. Your heartbeat raced like a drum you couldn't quiet. Your muscles, once proud and reliable, betrayed you. They cramped, shook, failed. The mountain didn't just test your strength, it unraveled it. And it never got better. There was no acclimating if you were already underfed and overworked. For the nobles, who spent only brief periods at the site and arrived prepared, the altitude was a mild discomfort. For you, the worker, it was a curse stitched into every bone. Some vomited daily. Others passed out mid-task. Dizziness wasn't rare. It was routine. One moment you were hauling stone, the next you were on your knees, gasping like a fish pulled from the river. If you were lucky, someone gave you coca leaves to chew to numb the headache and trick your body into continuing. But there were never enough. And the leaves didn't bring air back into the sky. Your heart pounded constantly. Not from exertion, but because it was desperately trying to keep you alive. The human body isn't designed for this kind of strain. At altitude, the heart works double time to pump what little oxygen there is. For a worker already weakened by hunger, stress, and cold, this meant chronic fatigue and a slow, silent decay from the inside. Sleep was worse. You'd lie down after a brutal day of labor, your limbs screaming for rest, only to wake up choking. The thin air made deep sleep rare and peaceful sleep almost impossible. Nightmares came easy in a place where your body believed it was dying. You'd wake drenched in sweat, disoriented, your heart hammering against your ribs like it was trying to escape. There were no doctors, no medicine, no sympathy, just the expectation to get up the next morning and do it all again. Some men never woke up. They didn't fall off cliffs. They didn't get crushed by stone. They simply didn't survive the altitude. Their bodies, worn thin and stretched to the breaking point, quietly gave out. The heart stopped. The lungs refused. And their names were never spoken again. Death without drama. Just one less set of hands on the rope. The altitude also warped your mind. Low oxygen meant poor concentration. You became forgetful. Irritable. Sometimes you didn't even realize you were making mistakes until the overseer shouted, or the stone cracked, or the rope snapped. And when that happened, it wasn't the air that was blamed. It was you. And in your mind, you started to believe it. You began to think maybe you really were weak. Maybe you weren't trying hard enough. You saw others pushing through the same haze, and you hated them for it, and hated yourself more for falling behind. But no one saw the invisible war happening inside your lungs. No one saw your blood thickening, your brain starving. They only saw whether or not the stone moved. What makes it worse is how beautiful it all was. The view from Machu Picchu is breathtaking in every sense, the kind of panoramic wonder that poets dream of and tourists chase. Green peaks cutting through silver mist, the Urubamba River winding below like a vein in the earth, birds soaring overhead on the kind of wind that feels holy. And you stood in that beauty every day and you hated it because it was killing you. You were dying inside paradise. And yet you stayed, you worked, you lifted. Not because you believed in glory, but because you had no choice. The mountain didn't care about your lungs. The overseer didn't care about your pulse. The empire didn't care about your sleep. The gods didn't descend to catch you when your knees gave out. No one came, so you pushed through. Because if you didn't, the mountain would bury you in silence. And even that would be more mercy than you were promised. The air at Machu Picchu might be thin, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unheard stories. Of men whose hearts beat too fast, too hard, too long. And who, in the end, faded into stone, wind, and memory. Survival at Machu Picchu wasn't just a matter of strength. It was a test of endurance against the impossible. And what made it worse was what you were given to survive. Almost nothing. There were no iron tools, no advanced technology, no gloves lined with protection. What you had were stone hammers, bronze chisels, ropes of twisted plant fiber, and a body already on the edge. The marvels of Inca engineering were born not out of comfort, but out of struggle. Brutal, improvised, relentless struggle. Your hands were your first and last tool. You woke up with them swollen and went to bed with them bleeding. Every strike of a hammer vibrated through your fingers like lightning. Bronze blades dulled quickly, forcing you to sharpen them again and again with simple stones. If a tool broke, you didn't get a new one. You fixed it. Or you waited. Or you carved with your fingernails until someone noticed. The ropes you used to drag stone were thick and coarse. They tore at your shoulders and hips. The fibers bit into your skin, especially when wet, and everything was always wet. Rain soaked the mountain constantly, turning mud into slick clay and ropes into waterlogged whips. If you slipped while pulling, your hands could be flayed raw, just trying to hold on. Clothing was minimal. A basic tunic. Sandals with soles so thin they did little against the jagged terrain. You wrapped your feet with rags when the blisters became too much, but those too wore through. Some workers limped for days before infection claimed their toes. There were no medics, no balm. You either healed or didn't. Food was scarce. The Empire provided rations, maize, dried potatoes, and occasionally a handful of coca leaves to chew. These were sacred, yes, but they were also fuel. Not enough to fill your belly, just enough to keep your body moving. You learned not to feel hunger. You ignored the emptiness, or you tried to fill it with prayers. And still, the mountain demanded more. You became creative in your survival. You learned how to tuck pebbles into your sandals to support your arches. You shaped your own tools from scrap when no one was looking. You hid food under stones for when the Empire's rations ran dry. Survival wasn't rebellion, it was necessity. But there were limits. When your body truly broke, when the bleeding wouldn't stop, when the cough wouldn't go away, when your hands could no longer hold even a chisel, you were quietly moved aside. You didn't go home. You didn't go to a healer. You simply stopped being useful. Others took your place. Your presence faded. Some say broken workers were given simple tasks like sweeping or hauling water. Others say they were left to waste away. History doesn't bother to answer. The shelters you slept in were barely protection. Rough thatched huts open to the wind. Fires burned low at night, and the cold crept through your bones. You slept with your knees pulled to your chest, clutching your tools like a lifeline. You dreamed of warmth, of a blanket, of your mother's voice. But when you awoke, it was always the same. Wet air, gray sky, and the echo of stone being carved. And through it all, you weren't just trying to survive physically. You were trying to survive emotionally, spiritually, because the greatest threat wasn't always death. It was forgetting who you were. The mountains stripped you down. It took your name, your stories, your voice. You became one of many, a face in the fog, a pair of hands in the line. You stopped thinking of yourself as a person and started thinking of yourself as part of the mountain. That's how you endured. You counted things. Not days, but stones. Not hours, but steps. You measured time in bruises and splinters, and how many times your tool struck before it cracked. Some workers carved tiny symbols into the backs of stones, their own secret marks hidden from view. Proof they had existed, that they were here, that the mountain hadn't taken everything. And when night fell and your body screamed for rest, you whispered songs from your village, quietly under your breath. Songs your grandmother sang, your father hummed while farming. You sang them not for comfort, but so you wouldn't forget the sound of home. That was the real tool of survival, memory. Because if you let that go, if you let the Empire reduce you to just a body, a back, a pair of hands, then even when you left, you were still lost. The tools were primitive, the clothes were thin, the rations were barely enough to live. But what truly kept you alive was the sliver of self the mountain couldn't break. The thing inside that said, I am still me. Even under the weight, even in the pain, even when no one remembers my name. And maybe, just maybe, one day, someone would. They told you the work was sacred, that every stone you lifted, every breath you took, was a gift to the gods. That your suffering wasn't just for the Empire, but for the divine. That what you endured on this mountaintop would echo in eternity. But what they never said, not out loud, was that your voice didn't matter. You were meant to serve, not speak. From the moment you arrived at Machu Picchu, silence followed you like a second shadow. The priest said the mountain was holy, that the spirits lived in the cliffs, that the gods were watching, and so you learned to hush your pain, to bite your tongue when your knees buckled, to scream inwardly when the stone crushed your back. The mountain wasn't a place for complaints. It was a shrine of discipline. Even in the quietest hours after the last stone had been set for the day, after the sun had dipped behind the peaks and the cold air wrapped itself around your bones, even then you didn't speak freely. Voices could carry. Overseers might listen. The gods might listen. You shared looks, gestures, songs whispered so softly they barely stirred the wind. The rituals made your labor feel holy, but also terrifying. Before a new structure was built, offerings were made. Sometimes animals, sometimes people. No one ever told you if the rumors were true. No one ever told you if the rumors were true. But you saw things. Small bundles wrapped in cloth carried reverently into newly laid foundations. Chants that turned darker than prayers. Blood on tools that hadn't been used for carving. You worked beside fear. Not just fear of death, but fear of divine judgment. You were told that if the gods weren't pleased, the mountain would curse your efforts. The stones would shift, the walls would fall. A worker might disappear, and so every mistake became a potential sin. The priests weren't cruel, not in the way the overseers were, but their eyes were colder. Their judgment came not from anger, but from belief. If you dropped a sacred stone, they didn't shout. They looked at you like you had insulted the sun itself. That weight, the moral weight, was sometimes heavier than the stone on your back. You were taught to be grateful, that to work here was an honor, that your suffering built not just temples, but connection to the gods. So you tried to believe it. You tried to turn your pain into something spiritual. You told yourself that your silence wasn't weakness, but strength, that to carry in quiet was to carry with dignity. But inside, you were still human. You missed your family. You missed laughter. You missed the sound of your own name spoken with warmth. You missed being more than just one body in a line of workers trudging through mist. When one of you died, it was rarely spoken about. Sometimes a priest would bless the spot, sometimes not. The labor didn't stop. Grief had no place on the schedule. You were expected to bow your head, offer a silent prayer, and keep moving. One less man, one more stone. Some tried to leave behind signs that they were more than just laborers. Carvings hidden beneath stairs. Marks sketched into stone where no one would see. Symbols only their loved ones would understand, if they ever made it back to tell them. It was rebellion, not against the empire, but against invisibility, because that's what the silence was really about. It erased you. It told you your voice was unimportant, your pain was sacred, your death was expected, and your name. Your name was not for history, it was for your family maybe, for the wind, but never for the records. Centuries later, when visitors walk Machu Picchu's paths, they are silent too, but for different reasons. They are struck by awe, by beauty, by the mystery of a place that seems untouched by time, but they don't know what kind of silence it was built on. A silence that wasn't peace, but pain. Not reverence, but repression. The city may have been royal, but the hands that built it were burdened. The priests may have blessed the ground, but the workers bled into it. And in the end, the empire got what it wanted, a monument, a masterpiece, a wonder of the world. But the workers, they were told to give everything and say nothing. And so they did. That is the final insult of Machu Picchu. Not just that it was built on suffering, but that the suffering was silenced, ritualized, justified, wrapped in gold and handed to history without a single name attached. The silence wasn't holy. It was stolen, and it still echoes through every perfect stone. You might think that once Machu Picchu was finished, once the last stone had been placed, the last terrace leveled, the workers could finally rest. But there was no rest, not for the living. But there was no rest, not for the living. not for the ones who had given their blood to the mountain. The Empire did not see you as someone who had completed a great task. It saw you as someone proven capable, and that meant you were sent away again. The Mida system never truly ended. It was supposed to be rotational, a form of temporary labor where every able-bodied man would serve the Empire for a set period, then return home. But in reality, temporary became a lie the Empire told to keep men quiet. Once you entered the system, it swallowed you. You were passed from one project to another like a tool that never stopped being useful. Roadwork in the Sacred Valley, stonework in Cusco, terraces in Vilcabamba, bridges across rivers you'd never seen before. Your hands learned to adapt to new places, but your spirit never recovered from the first. The worst part was that no one asked if you wanted to keep going. You weren't a volunteer, you were chosen. A name pulled from a village census, a quota to be filled. You were the body that met that number. And if you had a family, children, elders to care for, that didn't matter. You left them once, and you would leave them again, and again, and again. Sometimes you weren't even allowed to return home between postings. You were marched straight from one work site to another. A change of tunic, a new overseer, and more stone waiting for your hands. There was no time to heal. No moment to be a father, a son, a brother again. You began to forget what your own house smelled like. Your wife's face faded in your mind. Your children grew taller without you, and when they saw you again, they looked through you like you were a ghost. What made it worse was that the Empire always spoke of duty as a blessing. You were told that to serve was to honor your ancestors, that your suffering kept the gods happy and the Empire strong. But those words didn't warm you in the freezing highlands. They didn't feed your stomach when the rations ran dry. They didn't hold you when you collapsed from exhaustion, coughing blood into the earth. The priests and nobles spoke of glory. But for you, there was only gray sky and broken hands. And when your body could no longer keep up, when your knees buckled on the mountain trails, when your lungs rattled in your chest from the cold, you were discarded without cruelty, but without care. The Empire didn't punish you, it simply moved on. You were no longer chosen, you were simply left behind. Some men tried to resist, tried to hide or plead with the caraca, the local official, to spare them. But the Empire didn't care for excuses. If one man resisted, another was chosen in his place. Sometimes that meant your younger brother, your own son. The system always fed itself, and guilt became another weight you carried, long after the stones were gone. Even when you returned to your village, you were not whole. You came back limping, coughing, aged beyond your years. You carried more scars than stories. The younger men looked at you with awe, but they didn't understand what it meant to have survived a monument. You didn't tell them everything. You couldn't. How could you explain the silence of the mountain? The way your fingers still curled in your sleep, reaching for a chisel. The taste of coca that lingered in your mouth for months, not as comfort, but as necessity. And the Empire still wasn't finished with you. Even if your labor days ended, you were expected to train the next generation. Show them how to bind rope, how to read stone. You became the bearer of pain passed down like a craft. You told them the work was noble because to say otherwise would make your own suffering feel pointless. So the cycle continued, not just of labor, but of silence. Some men died at their final posting, buried beneath the very structures they helped build. Their bones became part of the foundation. No names, no markers. Just the quiet knowledge that 1,000 anonymous lives held up the beauty the world would one day come to admire. And even now, centuries later, those lives are forgotten. They say the Inca built without slaves. But what they don't say is that the Mida, though praised by historians, turned freedom into a schedule of sacrifice. That even when you weren't chained, you weren't free. That the draft never really ended. It just changed hands, changed sites, changed stories. And for the men who gave their years to Machu Picchu, the empire never gave them back. Coming home should have been a relief, a reunion, a moment of warmth after years of wind and stone and silence. But for the workers of Machu Picchu, the return home was often colder than the cliffs they left behind. Because time didn't pause in your absence, it moved forward without you, reshaping your village, your family, and your place in the world until you no longer fit. When you finally stepped back onto the soil of your birthplace, your heart swelled with memory. You expected the familiar, the voices, the smells, the embrace of kin. But instead, you were met with something far quieter, awkward nods, hesitant stares. Even your own children looked at you with wide, uncertain eyes. They had grown up in your absence, filled the gap of your silence with stories from others. And now here you were, older, thinner, weathered, a stranger wearing your name. Your wife had done her best to keep the household together. She had worked twice as hard, raising the children, tending the fields, offering up prayers that you'd return whole. But your return didn't bring ease. It brought disruption. You couldn't slip seamlessly back into a life that had evolved without you. The routines were different. The roles were filled. You wanted to help, to rejoin, to rebuild, but no one knew how to let you in. You had become a ghost in your own home, and your body betrayed you at every turn. You couldn't bend like you once did. Your hands were stiff, your back crooked from years of hauling stone. You limped when you walked. The cold that had seeped into your bones high in the Andes never truly left. You moved like an old man, even if you weren't yet old. You felt ashamed, not because you were weak, but because you no longer belonged in a world that demanded strength to survive. Worse still was the silence. No one wanted to hear what you had endured. It wasn't that they were cruel. It was that they were afraid. Afraid to hear about the things they might one day be forced to face themselves, the ropes that cut through skin, the freezing nights that cracked joints, the unmarked graves of those who never came home. So instead, they asked nothing, and you said nothing. You carried the mountain inside you, heavy and unspoken, and yet you were expected to be proud. Your village might have praised you with a simple offering, a meal, a seat at the council. They might have called you one who served the Cepa Inca, but behind their words was pity. They saw what the work had done to you, the hollow eyes, the cough that wouldn't go away, the way your hands trembled when you tried to carve or carry or build. You were proof of what it cost to be useful to the empire. Some tried to start over, to farm again, to raise animals, but their bodies couldn't keep pace. Others retreated into silence, fading from village life, watching their families from a distance. And some were sent back, drafted again, with little warning. The ink on the census was more powerful than the pain in your bones. You've done your part meant nothing if the empire needed labor. And all the while, you remembered the mountain, its mist, its silence, its impossible stones. At night, you still woke with your muscles twitching. You still dreamed of the cracking rope, the sound of stone shifting. Sometimes you stood outside your house at dawn, staring at the hills, imagining you were still on the trail, still one command away from another day of suffering. What no one told you, what you only learned too late, was that survival did not mean restoration. Coming home didn't make you whole. It simply returned you to a place that had moved on, and you were left to navigate the gap between who you were and who you had become. Even the children, once you taught them how to bind rope or carve stone, looked at you with quiet fear. They saw the toll before they ever knew the labor. They asked you questions you couldn't answer. Was it worth it? Did the gods really see? And all you could do was nod and pretend your silence was wisdom, not pain. The empire never came to thank you. The Cepa Inca never sent word. There was no reward, no retirement, no monument bearing your name. Your work had become part of something magnificent, a city in the sky, but you would never be remembered for it. Only the city would be, only the view, only the mystery. You returned home to live again. But what you had left behind was not just time. Tea was your place in the world, and it was never waiting for you. In the Inca Empire, work was never just work, it was worship. Every stone you lifted, every trail you carved, every wall you shaped wasn't just a civic duty, it was a spiritual offering. You weren't just feeding an empire, you were feeding the gods. And when something went wrong, when the rains came late, when a stone cracked, when a wall collapsed, it wasn't seen as poor planning or human error. It was seen as displeasure, divine disappointment, and that made the consequences terrifying. As a worker, you lived under the weight of sacred expectation. You were told the gods watched your hands, listened to your breath, studied the rhythm of your hammer. You believed it, because how could you not? The priestess said that Inti, the sun god, illuminated your path. That Pachamama, the earth mother, cradled the stones in her arms. That every cut you made, every wound you endured, echoed through the heavens. You weren't just building Machu Picchu. You were part of a cosmic plan, and there was no room for error. But error was inevitable. Maybe a stone fractured just before it reached the summit. Maybe a worker slipped and the block tumbled hundreds of feet below. Maybe the wall didn't align as it should, or a storm destroyed what had taken weeks to build. Whatever it was rarely forgiven, not by the overseers, not by the priests, not by the terrified whispers that followed the accident. When the gods weren't pleased, someone had to answer. Sometimes it meant an extra offering, more coca leaves, a sacred animal, but sometimes it meant blood. The line between punishment and sacrifice was never clear. You might be forced to work double shifts with no rest, pushed to your limits while the priests chanted nearby. You might be beaten, not for defying authority, but for offending divinity. A cracked stone became a crack in your soul. An injury became a mark of guilt. Your body was no longer yours. It belonged to the gods, and they were angry. Worse than the punishment was the shame. Failure in the empire wasn't private, it was paraded. If your task led to a problem, your entire group might suffer. You were ostracized, humiliated, whispered about. You stopped being a worker, you became a warning. Your friends stopped speaking your name. Even your family back home would hear of it and carry the burden of dishonor long after you were gone. Some workers vanished after such failures. No one talked about it. One day they were there, and the next. Gone. Taken by the priests, perhaps, or by the empire. Or maybe, just maybe, by their own hands. Despair clung to failure like moss on the stones. When your worth was tied to divine approval, losing that meant losing everything. The worst kind of failure wasn't what you did, it was what nature did. A flood, a landslide, a freak freeze. When Pachamama turned cruel, your work could vanish overnight. And no one blamed the earth. They blamed the people who had failed to honor her properly. Suddenly, all eyes turned to you. What ritual had you skipped? What thought had you dared keep unclean? Had you mumbled a complaint? Had your heart wandered from devotion? Even silence could be suspicion, and suspicion could mean punishment. Or worse, selection. Because sometimes, when the gods were truly displeased, a life had to be given. Human sacrifice was rare, but it was real. You'd heard the stories of children chosen for their purity, of workers chosen for their strength, of a ceremonial death to reset divine favor. The chosen one was drugged, robed, blessed, and sent into eternity. Some were buried beneath foundations, others sent to mountain peaks to freeze in solitude. It was called honor, but to the ones still breathing, it was horror. You prayed it wouldn't be you. You worked with devotion. You bit back pain. Oh, whispered sacred names, even as blood leaked from your palms. But deep inside, you knew the truth. No amount of devotion could guarantee safety. The god's favor was as fragile as the mountain path, and when it cracked, the fall was yours to take. So you carved a little more carefully. You carried each stone like a sacred object. You looked to the sky and whispered apologies for things you hadn't done. And even in your dreams, you asked forgiveness, just in case the gods were listening while you slept. Because in a world where stone was sacred, silence was holy, and perfection was demanded, being human was the greatest risk of all. They say Machu Picchu is one of the most breathtaking places on Earth, a marvel of architecture, a testament to human ingenuity, a city in the clouds that defied the limits of time and gravity. But for all the words written about its majesty, for all the poems, the photographs, the admiration, there is a silence deeper than the valleys that surround it. A silence where the names of its builders should be. There are no monuments to the workers, not a single plaque, not a carved wall bearing the names of the hands that cut the stone, hauled it, fitted it, bled for it. The real architects are long gone, but at least they are remembered in legend. The Sapa Inca, the nobles, the priests, their stories were passed on, but the workers, the thousands of lives spent shaping that mountain, history swept them away like morning mist. And maybe that was always the plan. The Inca believed in the collective. Individual glory was not the point, the empire was. The city was meant to honor gods and kings, not men. Your purpose as a laborer was to serve, to sacrifice, to disappear. Your hands left behind masterpieces, but your name was never meant to endure. And yet, how cruel, because those hands cracked under the weight of rope. Those shoulders buckled beneath stones as tall as men. Those hearts beat fast at altitudes where breath thinned and bones froze. And when the work was done, those same men were cast back into villages that had already begun to forget them, only to be taken again for the next task. No reward, no legacy, just more labor. Tourists walk those paths now. They marvel at the smoothness of the stones, the precision of the terraces. They snap photos, pose on the ledges, breathe in the beauty. But none of them feel what the workers felt. None of them hear the gasps of men carrying 50-pound slabs on their backs. None of them see the blood soaked into the cracks, dried and dusted over by centuries. They see a wonder. You saw a wound? And when you were gone, when your body finally failed, your lungs collapsed, or your knees gave out one last time, there was no burial of honor. Maybe you were laid in a shallow grave beside the trail. Maybe you were burned, your ashes tossed into the wind as quietly as you lived. Or maybe you were never found at all. Just one more man lost to the cliffs. Your children might remember you. For a while, they might tell stories of the mountain, of your calloused hands, of your silence. But over time, even those stories would fade. And then you would truly be gone, not just from the world, but from memory. And that is the final cruelty, because the Inca Empire, for all its brilliance, its roads, its terraces, its cities in the sky, was built on the backs of people it chose not to remember. It turned lives into infrastructure, pain into policy, sacrifice into silence. No statues honor your strength. No songs carry your name. No scrolls record your breath. But the stones remember. Every groove carved by your chisel. Every step worn into the trail. Every wall that stands despite centuries of rain and wind. These are your fingerprints. This is your monument, even if no one knows it. The world may call it Machu Picchu, but to you, it was never a city. It was a sentence, a place you endured, a place that took everything and gave nothing in return. And maybe, just maybe, telling your story now, centuries later, can break that silence. Maybe in speaking your name, even if we don't know it, we honor you in a way the empire never did. Because you deserved more than what you got. You deserved a monument. You deserve to be remembered. And this story is for you. Today, Machu Picchu is praised as a crown jewel of ancient civilization, one of the new seven wonders of the world. It graces travel posters, documentary titles, and the bucket lists of millions. Historians call it a triumph of Inca engineering, a spiritual center, a marvel untouched by conquest. But for those who built it, the silent workers who carved its bones and blood on its trails, it was something else entirely. Not a wonder, but a weight. Not glory, but grief. The stones didn't rise from the earth through divine blessing. They rose through suffering, lifted by men whose names we never learned. Every polished slab was dragged uphill by muscle and desperation. Every wall aligned with impossible precision was paid for in torn ligaments, crushed feet, and breathless nights. But when we speak of the Inca Empire, we don't speak of these men. We speak of emperors, of gods, of beauty. Their pain was buried beneath the glory. We remember the sight, but not the story. The tour guides will point to the Temple of the Sun, the royal tomb, the sacred rock, but not the dirt-packed shelters where workers slept forward to a corner. Not the crude tools they gripped with swollen hands, not the trail where a misstep meant death. There are no signs for those places, no plaques, no names carved into the stone for them. And yet, without them, there would be no wonder at all. This erasure isn't new. History has always remembered the visionaries, not the builders. The kings, not the carriers. The design, not the labor. It's easy to admire a city in the sky, harder to face the fact that such beauty was forged in exhaustion, that every elegant angle and majestic stairway was the final product of hundreds of ruined bodies, used up and forgotten before the first visitor ever arrived. To modern eyes, Machu Picchu seems serene, peaceful, eternal, but that's only because the empire succeeded in its most enduring lie, that this place was divine, that it was built through devotion alone, that the mountains gave it willingly. The truth, the unspoken truth, is that the mountain took everything from those who climbed it to serve. No modern traveler hears the old cries anymore. They walk the same steps the workers once walked, but they don't feel the weight of stone on their backs. They don't know the fear of slipping, the pressure of pleasing the gods, the ache of being forgotten. They see stone walls and take selfies. They call it magic. But the real magic was that anyone survived long enough to finish it. And even now, centuries later, the workers are not honored, not named, not known. Their bones, if found at all, are cataloged in museums under sterile labels: male laborer, early 15th century. Their lives are reduced to a few artifacts, a few scars on bone, a footnote in the story of an empire. It is the final silence. A lifetime of suffering reduced to a line of data. But there is one thing the empire can never erase: the fingerprints left in stone. Tiny tool marks on the underside of steps, hidden grooves behind altars, subtle evidence that a human hand, tired, shaking, blistered, was there. These are their signatures. These are their truths, and they will outlast us all. You don't have to be a king to deserve remembrance. You don't have to wear gold to leave a legacy. Sometimes all it takes is one stone, carried farther than it ever should have been, laid by someone no one thought to think. Machu Picchu is beautiful, but behind its beauty is a story of blood and silence. A glory built not by gods, but by ghosts. And now that we know the truth, it's time we speak their names, even if we can never know them. The empire watched everything. It saw when you were chosen for the Matmi'a, the great rotational labor system that the Inca used like a blade mast as a badge of honor. It saw when you left your family behind, clutching nothing but the state-issued tunic on your back. It watched you march into the mountains, lungs aching from altitude, eyes wide with fear. And once you arrived at Machu Picchu, it never stopped watching. The empire had eyes everywhere. The crackle tracked your labor. The quipu keepers recorded your output. The priests judged your devotion, If you worked quickly, you were noticed. If you fell behind, you were noticed. And if you broke, if your body collapsed under the weight of too much stone, or your hands bled through your wrappings, or your breath came in coughs too deep to ignore, the Empire noticed that too. But it never helped. You weren't a person. You were a measurement, a unit of labor, a number in the great design of the Sapa Inca's divine vision. Your suffering wasn't an obstacle, it was expected. It proved your loyalty. Your limits didn't matter. Your pain didn't matter. What mattered was the task, the wall, the alignment, the sky above you, and the Empire above that. And so you suffered, watched, but unseen. You learned to break quietly, to collapse without sound, to dig your fingers into the earth, and pull yourself up again before the overseer could notice. You masked your limp, you swallowed your blood, you wrapped your wrists in fresh cloth and kept climbing. Because once the Empire saw you truly broken, not slow, not tired, but done, you were no longer useful. And if you were no longer useful, you disappeared. No trial, no final word. Just gone. Some were sent back to their villages in disgrace, unable to work, branded with failure. Others were reassigned to harsher labor, mines, roadwork, the bitter cold edges of the Empire where no one returned whole, and some simply vanished. The lucky ones were buried. The unlucky ones became stories whispered among workers during brief moments of rest. Don't slip, don't speak, don't break, or you'll end up like him. It wasn't just the physical toll, it was the mental one. You began to question whether your thoughts were even your own anymore. You started the day thinking of your family, your village, your past. But by nightfall, all you could think about was surviving until morning. You forgot your name when no one used it. You forgot the faces of your children. You forgot what it felt like to laugh. Even in prayer, you found no comfort. The gods you once whispered to now loomed like judges. If your wall cracked, had you offended Inti? If your rope snapped, had Pachamama withdrawn her blessing? The fear was constant. The guilt soaked into your soul like the cold soaked into your bones. And the Empire watched that too. The Empire didn't want strong minds. It wanted obedient bodies. It didn't want workers to think, only to obey. When a man began to question, to doubt, to resist, he was either silenced or broken. Sometimes both. That was the cruelty of it all. That the greatest empire in the Andes, one that built roads across mountains and palaces in the sky, used its power not to uplift, but to grind men down until they no longer remembered what it meant to stand tall. And when the job was done, when the temple was built, the city completed, the Empire didn't thank you. It didn't remember you. It didn't send gifts to your family or carve your name in stone. You were simply moved, replaced, forgotten. The same eyes that watched you break looked away when you were gone. It's easy to admire the Inca for their organization, their engineering, their empire, but the truth beneath that awe is cold. It's that none of this was built without immense cost, not in gold, not in war, but in lives, in crushed hands, in cracked ribs, and forgotten graves, in men who were watched, measured, and discarded, all without ever hearing their names spoken aloud again. The Empire saw you break. And then it moved on. Long after the ropes were unbound, long after the chisels were put down and the last trail was walked, the weight remained. Not the physical burden of stone, but something deeper, invisible, the kind of weight that settles into your bones and never lets go. For the workers of Machu Picchu, the real cost of their labor wasn't just the calluses or the cracked joints. It was what they carried back with them and what they could never lay down again. Even when you left the mountain never really left you. Your hands twitched in your sleep, still reaching for tools that weren't there. You startled awake to the phantom sound of orders barked in the dark. Your feet ached every morning as if you had marched all night, even when you hadn't moved at all. The pain didn't vanish with time. It simply became familiar. A second skin. A quiet reminder that the Empire had once used your body like a machine and had never asked if you wanted it back. Your mind bore the worst of it. The silence you learned to survive in Machu Picchu followed you into your home, your family, your thoughts. You found it hard to speak, not because you had nothing to say, but because no one could understand what you had been through. They asked simple questions. Was it beautiful? Was it hard? You smiled, nodded, gave answers that didn't scratch the surface. Because how do you explain the kind of fear that lingers in your stomach for years? How do you describe what it feels like to be treated as sacred one moment and disposable the next? You stopped trying to explain. You just stopped. Even joy became difficult. A feast, a festival, a wedding, all of it felt distant. You were there, but not really. The laughter of your children echoed, but you didn't always react. You were proud to see them grow, but you also feared the future, because someday they might be chosen too. Someday their names might be called, and they'd walk the same path you did. And all you could do was pray they'd come back and not as broken as you were. The Empire didn't provide healing. There were no physicians for the spirit, no rituals for recovery. If you could no longer work, you were left to fade. The same hands that once lifted the stones of the Sapa Inca temple now struggled to lift a basket of maize. And yet, in the village, you were still expected to contribute, to pull your weight. Even if that weight had already pulled you apart, you tried to be useful. You taught the younger ones the craft, how to read stone, how to balance load, how to bind rope without snapping it. But every time you did, you felt a small knot in your chest. Because what you were passing down wasn't just skill, it was suffering. You were showing them how to survive, not how to thrive. How to endure what the Empire would one day demand of them. You watched their eyes wide with wonder, the same wonder you once had, and it hurt, because you knew where that road ended. Some tried to forget, they drank, they wandered. They disappeared. Others held on to scraps of meaning, the idea that their labor pleased the gods, that their suffering had a place in the grand story of the Empire. But deep down, you knew that the gods had many temples, and none had your name on them. The weight wasn't only memory, it was guilt. Guilt that you survived when others didn't, that you saw friends fall and kept walking, that you had moments of anger, of doubt, of desperation, and buried them deep enough to get through the day. You told yourself it was necessary, that survival was the only thing you could control, but the truth sat heavy in your chest because surviving felt like betrayal. To them, to yourself, you didn't want pity. You didn't even want recognition, you just wanted peace. A place where your hands could rest, where your thoughts weren't haunted by falling stone and tightening ropes. But peace was hard to find when the weight was still there, not on your back, but inside you. Years passed, the Empire continued. New roads, new temples, new Mitican scripts taking the same footsteps you once did. Nothing changed. And maybe that was the hardest part, that the world kept moving, kept building, kept praising the Empire's glory, never once stopping to ask what it cost. You weren't a warrior, you weren't a priest. You didn't wear feathers or gold or chant before the gods. But you were the reason they had walls to pray in, roads to march on, cities to rule from. And you carried that truth like you once carried stone, with effort, with silence, and with no one ever offering to help. Because the weight never left, and neither did the wounds. Despite the pain, despite the cold, despite the crushing stone and the prayers whispered into the wind, they endured. The laborers of Machu Picchu, nameless though they remain, carried a weight few can comprehend, not just on their backs, but in their hearts. They were not heroes in songs. They were not generals or nobles or kings. No one etched their faces into history, but they survived something few ever could, the complete surrender of their bodies and years to a system that never asked if they were ready, that never cared. And still, they endured. Their survival was not glamorous. It was not romantic. It was not praised. It was slow and quiet. It looked like wrapping raw hands in cloth for the 100th time. Like chewing coca leaves to dull the ache in the chest. Like forcing stiff knees to climb one more step on a mountain that never stopped rising. Like lifting one more stone when the arms could barely move. There was no choice, only motion. What gave them the strength? Maybe it was the thought of their children, the hope that their labor would buy just a little more time before their own sons were called to serve. Maybe it was love, or memory, or simply instinct, the raw, unkillable human urge to survive, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The empire might have owned their time, their bodies, their future, but it never fully claimed their spirit. Even when the stones bruised their skin, even when their names were forgotten, even when the world moved on, they endured. And that matters, because survival in silence is still strength. Because labor in the shadows still shapes the world. Because even if no one said thank you, even if no one carved their names into the sacred rock, the laborers left their mark. Every wall that still stands, every stairway that defies gravity, every perfect joint between impossible stones, all of it exists because someone who had every reason to stop didn't. They didn't rise to power. They didn't write the laws. They didn't sit on thrones or bask in ceremony, but they carried empires. And they built wonder. And in a world that forgets the ones who suffer in silence, that kind of endurance is a miracle. So when we look at Machu Picchu today, when we gasp at its beauty, marvel at its precision, walk its ancient paths, we must remember this. It was not gods who built it. It was not kings. It was not magic. It was people, ordinary people, exhausted people, broken people, resilient people. And they did not endure so we could forget them. They endured because they had no other choice. And yet they still gave their strength, their years, and often their lives to raise something greater than themselves, something they would never be credited for. That is sacrifice. That is endurance. And that is what built Machu Picchu. Their names are lost, but their work still stands. Their voices are silent, but their labor still echoes. And maybe that is how we honor them now, not by knowing every detail, but by acknowledging the truth that beneath every monument is a foundation of unseen suffering, and that the strength of a people is not measured by the glory of their rulers, but by the endurance of those who were never allowed to rest. So let us speak for them. Let us remember them. Let us say the words history never wrote down. We see you, we remember you, and you mattered. Because in the end, the mountain didn't build Machu Picchu. They did. They didn't wear crowns. They didn't stand atop pedestals. They were not the faces carved into legend, but the hands that made the legends possible. The workers of Machu Picchu were sons, fathers, brothers, ordinary people who were asked to endure the extraordinary. They were pulled from their homes, sent to the sky, and told to build perfection under pressure so great it left them broken long before the city was finished. And yet, they did it. They lifted stones heavier than their hope, climbed paths thinner than their breath, and gave every last ounce of strength to raise a city that would forget their names. History erased them. But we won't, because remembering them matters. Speaking for them matters. Every wonder we celebrate has a shadow, a cost paid in silence. And tonight, we've looked into that silence and found something beautiful, resilience. They may never have been honored in their time, but here in our time, we choose to remember. We honor their pain, their perseverance, and their humanity. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If this story moved you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. It helps more than you know, and it keeps stories like this, stories that deserve to be heard, from slipping back into the silence. And now, wherever you are, whether you're resting from your own kind of mountain or simply pausing before the next day begins, we wish you peace. To the forgotten workers of Machu Picchu, we remember you. And to our viewers, from our hearts to yours, thank you. Sleep well. Good night.